Welcome, everybody. This is CO Talks, the living room. We are gathered here this afternoon. It's Sunday, February 21st, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, U.S. And this is uh, an event called Chamber Music Friends and Fine Stringed Instruments, Transcending the Boundaries of Time and the Challenges of a Pandemic. It's a conversation I'm going to be having with Peter Benalil and Philip Kass. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this first ever CO Talks event. I am Eva Lerner-Lam, chairwoman and president of the CO Music Society Foundation, and I'd like to thank our production team for making today's Zoom webinar, our very first one, possible. For those of you who may be new to CO Music, I'd like to immediately take some of the mystery out of who we are. CO is Shanghainese for Western music. It's as simple as that. And you pronounce it just as you would the two alphabet letters C and O, CO. The organization was founded by my parents in 1964, and it was incorporated in 1966 as an IRS 501c3 not-for-profit cultural and educational institution, which it remains to this day. They were amateur musicians, Sao Wing and Jean L. Lam, who loved classical music. My mother was a pianist and my father was a violinist and a violist. Together with friends, most of whom were professional musicians, but many of whom were also amateurs, they created a way for musicians and their supporters to gather and exchange information and knowledge about great Western classical music right here in America. In fact, right here in their living room. My parents opened up their home to their CO friends nearly every weekend. It was not unusual for there to be 10, 20, 30 people from all walks of classical music life dropping in to play chamber music, to share stories about some special violin that had been recovered in a pawn shop in Phoenix, or to bring a talented young player in need of a good instrument to be introduced to a prospective sponsor. They would dine on my mother's home-cooked buffet meals, gather in small groups to examine someone's new acquisition, assemble in the living room to try out beloved sonatas, trios, quartets, and quintets by the great European masters. Fast forward half a century, and here we are in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. My parents have passed on, but I am proud to say that their legacy lives on at their residence in Tenafly, New Jersey, because CO Music Society Foundation is now able to host events at their home, and friends, young and old, can gather once again to enjoy the pleasures of friendship and great classical music. Today's inaugural CO Talks event is taking place virtually, as most everything these days has had to do. The silver lining in this pandemic is that many more of us can now join in the conversation than if we were in fact only hosting the event live at my parents' home and not by Zoom. My guests today are extraordinarily special to me. Peter Benoliel was one of my parents' dearest friends. My mom would practice extra hard and prepare an extra special meal whenever she knew he would be coming to play chamber music with her and my dad. A successful corporate CEO with a magnanimous philanthropic heart of gold, Peter found grace and beauty in chamber music, and he and my parents shared a truly special friendship that comes along only very rarely. Philip Kass is, hands down, one of the world's most trusted experts when it comes to fine stringed instruments. A nod from Philip Kass could resolve a difficult negotiated purchase of a fine violin. A frown could scuttle that same deal. He is knowledgeable, honest, and truthful. He is knowledgeable, honest, and truthful, and one of the pillars of today's fine instruments world. So it is a special honor and privilege for me to host today's conversation with Peter and Philip. And without any further ado, let's begin. Peter and Philip, please tell us, when did you first meet? Let's start with Philip.
Okay. Well, I met Peter across the counter at the Menig shop when he came in with a very lovely Amati violin. And I actually knew who he was because I have always invested in the stock market. And at that particular moment, I had stock in his company. So I saw the name, I read the annual report, and I knew exactly who this was. And I thought this was very exciting, but it meant that I remembered him. And it wasn't immediate, but eventually we then had an opportunity to play together. And we had a regular quartet for a long time, which was a great pleasure. And unfortunately, as is my wont, I started traveling a great deal. And you can travel or you can play regular quartets, but it's very difficult to do both. And we fell out of touch other than our annual holiday letters. But I'm looking forward now on Wednesday. I will have my first opportunity to play with Peter in, 10 years, maybe more. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking forward to it very much. And I'm even practicing, which is almost unheard of for me.
Well, I remember, I have the same memory, and I'm glad to have it. With my memory fading at my age, I'm glad to have Philip bolster it. But I remember very well walking in the shop with the violin, which I had purchased through auction at Sotheby's. And I was so amazed because when I took it in, I was not a customer of Menig. Of course, I knew of him and his reputation. And I thought a violin of this pedigree deserves the best. So I took it to him and introduced myself to him, although Philip was there. And by the way, I was totally unaware of what Philip has just told you about being a shareholder of my company. I just learned that less than a week ago from him. But at any rate, he was a bystander at that point, although he played a role going forward. But I told Mr. Menig, I said, I've purchased this violin, and I'd like you to look at it and to give me your opinion as to whether it needs any repairs and to make repairs if necessary. I suspect it needs adjusting. The sound post probably needs adjusting, although I'm not sure. So would you please, may I leave it with you? Would you please attend to it? And he didn't take it out of the box. He just looked and said, so you're the fellow who got the violin. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, you bought this at the Sotheby's auction. I said, yes, how did you know? Well, he said, I was very familiar with the auction and the fiddles that were, and the various instruments that were to be auctioned, but I had no idea who purchased this. So I'm very pleased. It's right here in front of me. But I was totally amazed at the expertise that someone would just look at the table of the violin, didn't take it out of the box, and immediately identify it. It turned out that the violin was in very good shape and I think there was one or two cracks Philip may know that needed repair, and an adjustment to the sound post was made. And that was roughly like 1981 or two. And so it's been a 40-year love affair that I've had with this fiddle. And I play it now that I have more time. I play it, practice virtually every day. And as I've told Philip, it has a better fate in store for it after I shuffle off the mortal coil, I've left it Curtis Institute so some really fine players can play it because it's a beautiful, beautiful sounding instrument.
Well, Peter, you were a corporate CEO of Quaker Chemical. How was it that you ended up going to Sotheby's to try to purchase an auctioned violin?
I think your family may have something to do
Oh no.
in that I had no real exposure. I knew of the great violin makers. I mean, I knew the names, I knew they, but I'd not had any personal contact with instruments of that breed until I met your family. And then I was surrounded by it in your living room on the various weekends that you described. And of course, one wonderful rendezvous I had with your folks in Hong Kong, where
Oh, I didn't know.
with through your father, we met Mr. Sin.
Sin,
Beautiful.
CM Sin.
Yes, who was a great collector.
Yes.
And I remember spending one afternoon in Mr. Sin's apartment, your father and I playing with two members of the Hong Kong Philharmonic.
Hmm.
And I think we had three Strads and a Guadagnini under our chins. And
What an incredible collection.
it
Yes.
was just an incredible time. I can go on about the violin, the manner in which I bid on it, and a cute story. When I returned to this country with a violin in tow, if after a business trip, obviously going through customs, I was asked whether I had anything to declare, and I answered in the affirmative that I had purchased this violin. And the customs officer said to me, "Well, is it new?" I said, "No, it's used."
Old.
He said, "Fine." And that was the end of it. Uh, that was the end of it.
I have a funny story sort of in that line too, but you're featured today, so I'll hold off on some for some other time. Um, it, you did share with me once how you bid on that instrument. Could you tell everybody about how that went?
Well, as I say, I became more interested in the fine instruments now that I had personal contact with them, principally through your family. And uh, I began to, and I was an art collector in those days. I still have a collection. I love it, but I don't collect anymore. At my age, you want to get rid of things, not gather things. So I was very well aware of Sotheby's. I received all their catalogs on prints and etchings and works on paper. So I thought it'd be fun. Let me learn more about these instruments and how often they come up, and I always loved the sound of an Amati. So I always had said to myself, someday I may be able to afford an Amati, a good violin. I had a good violin, but I mean a great violin. And so for several years, I'd say for a good 7 to 10 years, I've been seeing all these catalogs from Sotheby's. And I was looking through this huge catalog of a huge sale with marvelous instruments and came across this Brothers Amati. And I was taken that the price range seemed rather low. So I read the small print and saw that it was the scroll of the violin was not the original scroll. And that I'm not a collector, and that was not a real concern to me. I wanted the violin because of the sound it would make, and presumably would make a better sound than I could make with my present violin. So, at any rate, I thought, well, I'll bid on its low range, and uh, I'll give them a very outlandish bid that probably won't succeed. So I made my range, my top of the range. I put it 10% below their low estimate. And I really never thought about it after that. And much to my amazement, not only did I win, but the price was about 5% below my top bid. And I had figured, I suspect, and Philip might have an opinion on this, that you had a number of great collectors and that they weren't interested in a fiddle like this. They were concentrating on the Guarneris and the Guadagninis and so on, the Steiners. And this might get overlooked. And apparently it was overlooked, or at least no interest or little interest. And I'm the lucky guy that got.
It's just a fascinating story, I think, from the buyer's perspective. I wonder, Philip, can you share with us some of your experiences in and around these kinds of auctions?
Well, I've made a habit of going to the auctions, well, spring and fall, perhaps for the past 15, 20 years. And there's always a wide assortment, nowhere near as interesting, though, I have to say, as the assortment that Peter would have seen. I have that catalog in my library, and it's enormous. And there were like 400 and some odd lots, and any one of them would have been the top lot in an auction today. But yes, and everything is out there with some general accounting of, opinion of the auctioneer as to what it is. And then I'm free to go through and draw my own conclusions, which I usually do.
And that big catalog, 400
Yes.
instruments, where does one go now to get 400 instruments to look?
Well, you don't. That's the problem. In those days, there would be one or maybe two auctions a year at Sotheby's that would be in excess of 400 lots, and 400 fairly high-end lots. The weaker, less interesting instruments would go in the sort of let's call it the odd lot sales. I would say the major sales would be in November and in March, and occasionally in June. And then they would have a sale in September and a sale in April. And these would have the items that would be considered lesser, so to speak. Good 20th century modern Italian violins and 19th century Austrian and 18th century Mittenwald. Those would all go into the odd lot sales.
Well,
So
where would a buyer go these days to try to find, to pick and choose?
yeah, well, you have to take all the auctions together. There's the Terezio auction, which is they have auctions in New York and in London. There's the Ingalls and Heyday, which is the old Sotheby's auction department. It was privatized, so to speak. And they have biannual sales in London. There's Brompton, which has a number of different sales, but they will always have a very big sale in March and in October now. And there's several other smaller auctioneers, but Brompton's and Terezio might, and Ingalls and Heyday might reach 300 lots in a big sale, but very rarely, and not exclusively of the very top quality instruments.
So over the last 30, 40 years, the fortunes of Asia have changed a lot. And as Peter said, even back in the 70s, 80s, there was an amazing collection by Mr. C.M. Sin.
Yes.
Do you see auctions, for example, at Guardian or other Asian auction houses start to get interested in, or are they already doing auctions of instruments?
They're doing some, but the problem is the bulk of the instruments are still in the United States and continental Europe. And the bulk of the expertise is still in this side of the Pacific. So most of the buyers will tend to come over here or go to London.
I see.
Looking for the fine instruments. You mentioned CM, and that brings a happy memory to mind. He walked in completely unannounced one day and said he was looking for a Vuillaume.
Uh-huh.
And at the time, he was trying to collect the Vuillaumes that were made as exact replicas of the great ones. Well, we just so happened to have one of the great Messiah copies, a late period one, and he decided he liked it. And we ended up spending a good part of that weekend negotiating with the owner,
Mm-hmm.
in which case I would be on the phone with the owner and I would tell him what they said, and he'd tell me how to negotiate back. It was great fun. And then it was successful. And so I ended up bringing the violin to London with me to deliver to him. And from that time on, we would communicate regularly. We would get together when I'd be in Europe. Um, one of my wife's best friends has a home in the Isle of Man, in the town of Aachen. And it turns out CM has a home there too.
Oh.
And so I actually visited him there one time, looked through the collection, and we played Mozart duos, which was great fun.
um, Peter mentioned C.M. Sin, and I've met him many times as well. And of course, my dad is now gone, and I ended up helping my mom take care of the instruments that my dad had collected. I was wondering, Philip, in your experience, how do you help people who inherit these things? It's a little bit of a
Yeah.
it's a little bit of a leap of faith that there's
Yeah.
somebody who even is interested in helping a widow or a child who inherits these. Can you share some experiences, good or bad, uh, on what happens? Because usually it's somebody who's very successful in business,
Mhm.
right? And he's got one or two or three or more instruments that he has really just nurtured and loved, and then he's gone, and then the widow or the children are left with these incredible
Mhm.
treasures. Do you have any experiences,
Oh,
advice?
gosh. Well, what I always end up doing in these situations is trying to track down the paper trail on the instruments. I've always had advised clients that if they were thinking about estate planning, they needed to make sure that they had all the documents and all the recent appraisals at hand so that the family knew what they had and where it was and how to put their hands on those documents in order to get the best prices.
Mm.
Um, and every now and then you come across somebody who had no idea what they had, and of course then you give them a very nice surprise. More difficult is when you come across somebody who has something they've been told is very outstanding, and you're faced with the task of having to tell them it's not.
Oh,
I had one amusing situation some years ago where a family asked me to come in to look at the collection of their grandfather, and I went through one ordinary, badly damaged or a questionable instrument after another. And I got to the end and there really was nothing. And I said, well, where did all these come from? Well, my father bought them from some of his friends in Italy. And I said, well, are there any other instruments? Well, we have only the new ones, but they're probably not interesting to you. Well, let me take a look at them anyway. And they started bringing out shopping bags full of brand new, unused violins by some of the most important modern Italian makers of the 20th century. Who were the people who had been supplying all these instruments to him? And most of them had never even been set up. So I had the pleasure of saying, the things that you thought were nothing, that were in shopping bags in the closet, that's where the value is.
Interesting.
that's
Interesting.
interesting.
Peter, do you can you share with us some of your thoughts?
Well, I was going to just say, coming back to CM, not only did I enjoy being his guest in his apartment and his hospitality through your dad in Hong Kong, but he was here in Philadelphia, as Philip alluded, and he spent an evening at my home, and and as I remember, he and I played duets as well, the Mozart duets. He did not. He refused to play with us in Hong Kong. I guess because he had two fine players from the
That's
Philharmonic.
sure.
And so he deferred to your father and myself. I offered, but Mr. Sim was very gracious and know you enjoy it and play.
Uh-huh.
So
With the living room behind me, I remember when I came back from San Diego to work with my dad in 1984. One of the first things he did after I landed was he sat me down on the couch set up, and he said, "Here's a notebook." There was this little small loose leaf notebook, and I, I, I don't know if you remember this, Peter, but Dad used to set up his 12 violins on each of those sofa cushions behind me, and he went through each one, and he, not as a professional at all, but he said, "Okay, let's call this one A1, and this is made by so and so, and I bought it in such and such a year." I was just a note taker. I didn't know anything about violins. I'm a civil engineer, a very amateur pianist. You don't want to hear me play the violin. So I was just his secretary. I took down these notes, and Philip, I can't tell you, since I was the executrix for my mother's estate, I am so glad my dad did that.
Yeah.
And for each of the instruments, he made me get a manila envelope, not a manila envelope, a yellow envelope with a string thing on the back. I don't even know what we call those anymore. But he said, "Okay, so here's a certificate from Wurlitzer, here's a certificate from Menig, and put them in this A1. Okay, and then now let's do A2." Uh, that was so important. And he probably learned how to do that from those gatherings on weekends when people like the early version of Philip Kass, uh, probably Dario Dattili actually, probably advised him to do that. And so the first thing that I had to do when I came back from being a civil engineer was be my secretary and take these. I am so glad he did that.
did he buy his instruments mainly at auction or from dealers or both?
Never bought from auction. He never bought from auction. They were actually always introduced to him in that living room. They,
By a dealer.
usually by a dealer. Every now and then, actually, I think some he had 54 bows, amazing bows, Pageauts, Torts, Mares, and some of those came just as friends, people who came with friends
Right,
to the house and said, "Here, I've got 3 bows. Would you be interested?" And that would just be a private transaction.
right.
Hmm. But most of them were from dealers. The dealers, I have their letters, before email. um, Everybody was writing on stationery, and I have boxes and boxes of letters from all sorts of dealers who wrote to my dad with photos, photocopies of images of violins, and long letters of talking about how, "Oh, I'm going to be traveling to such and such an island, and it's too bad we'll miss each other." Very, very personal kinds of correspondences. I think it's a lost art nowadays.
And CO, you're now retain the ownership of those violins?
No, no, no. CO and my father's collection had nothing to do with each other. My father's collection was bequeathed to the 4 children.
I
And so I got 3. Each of my siblings and I got 3 of his instruments, and we've all done something different with ours. Uh, CO right now, because I'm so familiar with how CO works, I am able to lend 2 of the instruments to CO on a gratuitous loan. I don't charge CO anything. CO finds musicians who need fine instruments to perform with them, just to keep them in use. One of them, the 1734 Strad, is now on exhibit, has been on exhibit since 2008 at the Museum of the Violin. Well, let's see. To be precise, it was at the Museum of the City of Cremona in 2008. And then in 2012, when the city of Cremona opened the Museum of the Violin, beautiful place, uh, they moved the violin over there with their own city collection. And so that instrument is played every few weeks, and is curated by the curator of the Museum of the Violin. And it often goes on uh, with security. It often goes to perform in different places. So I've accompanied the instrument also to Rome, to Milan, to Venice, to Croatia, and it's been a good journey for the instrument. Many fine musicians have played the 1734 Strad
And
since he
it's on
first.
permanent loan to the museum.
Yeah, until they don't want it anymore. Space is very precious in the museum, but they continue to welcome it there.
Okay.
Sergei Krylov has played it. Dan Drew has played it. Eric Silberger has played it. Many CO artists. Jimmy Lin, of course, who's our master violin artist, has played it. So it's comfortable. It's healthy. And a lot of people get to see it because it's in the museum. And it's played every few months, at least, in community outreach concerts that are hosted by the Museum of the Violin. They're all like family, I think. You
Yeah,
know,
I
lots of
understand.
musicians who have come through this living room can really relate to these instruments as if they're brothers or cousins or sisters. It's for me as a non-violinist who didn't come into this whole realm until after my dad passed away, really. That was 1988. I was just trying to really protect my mom from folks who were not nearly as trustworthy and honest as Philip, who wanted to get their hands on these instruments. I just put up a wall around my mom and said, "Don't feel pressured, Mom. You know, you don't need the cash right now. Just let me get a book together for you." I did put a book together. It took it took 10 years for me to put the book together, but I put a book together with photos and descriptions of each of my dad's instruments, all of them, and his 54 bows. And that has been really helpful to me keeping track of things, in now that my dad is gone, now that my mom is gone. So documentation, I think, is just so important to people in this world. It's not only important to the museums, it's also important to the families and to the people who will inherit these things after the immediate family goes off into the distance. The new folks. I mean, I have some of these. They're on. It's not parchment, but they're really precious paper, right? Rembert Wurlitzer certificate, dated, I don't know, early 1900s. I mean, I'm holding these documents and thinking how how much love and appreciation for these works of craftsmanship uh, needed to exist in order for that whole ecosystem to not only exist but survive all these years. And now at this point, I've now digitized these certificates. I still have the originals, but even more exciting is that the Museum of the Violin is now able to work with experts to get infrared and ultraviolet imaging of these fine instruments. And they even have an anechoic chamber at the Museum of the Violin where all other sound is deadened, but they can play the pure sound of any violin that's in that anechoic chamber and record that in high resolution. This is technology helping to preserve and document these extraordinary instruments. It's fascinating. Peter, after this pandemic is over, we have to go to Cremona together. Yeah.
I've been there, of course, but I haven't been there for many, many years.
And you haven't
Uh,
seen the Museum of the Violin.
No, I haven't. So that
Right.
Mm,
would be a real.
We'll have to, we'll
museum
have,
is amazing.
And
yeah.
you go quite often, don't you, Philip?
Well, the last time I was in Italy was a year ago. In fact, I flew home from Italy a year and 2 days ago and skipped Cremona because I thought, well, I'll be back in March. I'll go then.
Right.
Well, of course, 2 days after I got home, the country locked down. And not long after that, we locked down. And I haven't been back since, but it's on my short list of things to do. Soon as I can get on a plane and go over there again and be allowed into the country,
Right,
I'm going.
right.
All right, we'll meet over there, and
Okay.
we'll make that a for certain date. Now we have some questions for those of you who are attending. We have 51 people attending our little conversation this afternoon. For those of you who are attending, if you'd like to ask a question orally, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you. In the meantime, I do see two questions. One is from Therese Dolan. Peter, could you show us your violin? Is it handy?
Well, yeah, I have to get up and get it, but I'll,
All
and
right, well, I'll ask, let's see, there's another question. If you can do that, let me answer this other question from Teresa Mular, Dr. Teresa Mular. Question for me. How and when did your parents start their music career and collection of such important violins? Did they come from a family of musicians? No. My gosh, my father's parents actually discouraged him from studying music because he was one of three sons in a family of 9 children. And he was the one with some sense of business. And so they discouraged him from studying music. They wanted him to just focus on business. So it was a challenge for him. And I think, after he became relatively successful in business, he was really happy to start really delving into the beauty of the violin and chamber music. My mother learned from a Russian teacher. Her father felt like a proper Shanghainese young lady should know how to play the piano. So she learned for sort of the wrong reasons. She was very deliberate about her practicing. My gosh, she was really determined to practice. Even with 4 small children, she was still washing diapers. Oh my gosh, by hand. And she would still sit down at night, 11 o'clock, and practice her piano half an hour every day, every evening. Thank you so much for that question. And there's Peter's violin.
can
There
you
it
see
is.
it?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
yes.
Now, which Amati, or is it a brother's
It's
Amati?
a Brothers Amati,
Huh. And
1622.
amazing.
Mhm.
Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing.
A beautiful instrument to look at
Yes.
Gorgeous.
as well as to play.
Absolutely gorgeous. Stephanie Kerman asks, why are violins that are made today not as good as the old violins? Philip?
Well, they're not. It's not that they're not as good. I think in many respects they're every bit as good. And I'd say on average, violin making is on a much finer level today than it was back then. But as far as the aspect of sound, there's always been the appeal of having an older violin simply because as an instrument gets used, the tone improves. And so, the great classic instruments have a 300-year head start on what's being made today. So if we can come back and re-examine this in about 150 years, then we will have some new light to shed on it.
I have a question, Philip. If people are interested in learning more about violins, and they had an unlimited travel budget,
Mhm.
and there was no coronavirus, where would you
Mhm.
tell them to go? I know there's a museum in South Dakota. Um,
I would definitely go to South Dakota,
isn't that interesting?
which is in the process of rebuilding their museum, and I think they're hoping to reopen next year.
Hmm.
Um, that's a definite place to go. The Metropolitan Museum has a wonderful collection. There's a wonderful collection at Yale in New Haven. There's actually a very fine collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Art.
Oh, I didn't
Uh,
know that. Hmm.
I would definitely go to the Ashmolean, which has the Hill collection. Um, and the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Where's that?
And of course, in Italy, I would go to Cremona, to the museum and at the Castello in Milan. The Castello Sforzesca has a fine collection. The Milan Conservatory has a fine collection, not displayed in the most ideal way, but you can see things there. And then probably two of the greatest collections, which really you wouldn't want to miss, would be the Paris Conservatory collection, which is at the Musée de la Musique in Paris, and the Brussels Conservatory collection, which is at the Museum of Musical Instruments in Brussels, very close to the Royal Palace.
Mm.
So, and then that's not even getting into the Germans. If you really want to know about the German makers, you must go to Mittenwald and you must go to Markneukirchen, because pretty much everything that a German did came out of being trained in one of those two cities.
Uh-huh. Now, what about the museum in Moscow?
I understand it's quite good. It started with, I think his name was Morozov. He was an industrialist, and his collection was confiscated after the revolution. I understand it's a very good collection. I've never been there. It would require my going to Russia. I have some issues about that.
Uh-huh. But what about the Chimay Museum?
Chimay is another one not to miss, but you'd better allow extra time. I spent a week at Chimay about 3 years ago, and I didn't even come close to seeing everything. It's an incredible museum and an incredible collection, and it was on my short list of places to return this year. Of course, something got in the way of that.
Right. We have a question from Dr. Muller, a question for Philip. How did you train to practice your profession, and are there formal schools to learn your trade?
There are no formal schools. My training came from going where the instruments are. I went to work with a leading shop. I spent 25 years there looking at everything that came through the door. And because it was a leading shop, we had enormous quantities of everything coming through the door. The vault, when I first started there, I described as being Noah's Ark. There was two of everything. It was just a wonderful collection, a wonderful opportunity for study. The tools that I brought to it were actually the tools of the art historian. I had studied art history as one of my minor classes in college, and I loved the methodology that they used in analyzing articles, artworks. And I applied that to the instruments. And that was really it. You just need to see a great deal and allow a lot of time to do that, because they just don't come walking in the door every day, and make notes about them and compare specific characteristics, looking for commonalities and differences, and then piece it all together.
Remarkable skill and dedication to this trade. A question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would ask a question of Phil. Why does the sound get better with age?
I'm not sure, but it's been a truism in the violin world since the mid 1600s. It's already in the days of Niccolo Amati, there was a premium paid for the instruments of his father and his grandfather. And the people who'd worked under him could get more for their instruments if they would relabel them as Niccolo Amati's. But the major point of it was that those instruments were older, they had been used more, they had a track record. Frequently, they had a connection to some famous musician that gave them a more interesting backstory, so to speak. I think all that goes into it. And then, of course, if you have a choice between something that looks ordinary and something that looks beautiful, which do you want to play? Well, obviously the beautiful one.
We have a question from Eric Barr. He asks, was the wood used by the early makers significantly different than the wood that's used now?
Well, it's now 300 years old, but when they made the instruments, the wood was 5 to 10 years old in most cases. It was just good quality wood. The There was more of a premium paid to the quality of the wood, and because it was used so much more in everyday manufacturing. But most of all, there was that much more in the way of forest land to be used, and so there was much more to choose from in terms of quality.
Question from Rebecca Rodman for Philip. She's wondering if you happen to know from our mutual friends in Cremona when the next exhibition is hopefully being planned.
I don't, and unfortunately, I've been out of touch with them since I got home from that trip last year. Um,
Okay.
when I've talked to people, they well, yeah, they've all been stranded in their homes as well.
Another question for Philip. What is your experience with counterfeits?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure we have enough time to go into that. There are plenty of them. I mean, it seems strange to us to think about it today, but there have been numerous periods in music history when there have been more good old violins than there were people to play them,
Hmm.
and not a strong collector's market. And a maker making modern instruments might find that the only way they could make an instrument and sell it would be to label it as somebody else's work.
Hmm.
There's some schools where that the instruments that you're seeing were each generation made replicas of their teachers and passed them off as their teachers' work, and it's just gone on generation after generation. But you learn to recognize them. That's all.
That's part of what makes your trade so tricky and so tough and tough to stay above the fray and win everybody's um, respect and trust. Um, John Keene asks, are there significant ranges of quality of sound in instruments by the same historic violin maker, such as Amati, made at the same time?
The truth is, I look at them, I pick them up, I study them. I very rarely ever draw a bow over them. Because the sound isn't what establishes the value. It's the determinations of who made it are drawn from the wood and the craftsmanship and the materials used, and not from the sound. However, the great makers are great makers partly because the instruments they made are beautiful, and partly because they consistently sounded well. That said, if you take 10 musicians and put them in a room, you will very quickly have 11 or more opinions about what is good sound. And every player is different, so every player will find different instruments work for them.
Yeah, and I can add to that in that if Heifetz plays my violin or I play it, there'll be a difference in the quality of the sound. Depends on the musician. The other thing I will say is over the years, I have met a number of musicians with the brothers Amatis. We have one right in the Philadelphia Orchestra,
Yep.
one at the Grand Teton Music Festival,
Mhm.
and so on. And we've compared and played together in many
Mhm.
cases. And what's remarkable, to your point, the sound is very similar.
Yes.
I mean, it just unmistakably sounds
Mhm.
like a brothers Amati.
Right.
It's just fascinating. I completely agree with Peter's observation. I have Jane Levy. I can't resist sharing with you what Jane Levy has said. She says there are several great Amatis for sale on eBay for $225. um, Sawai Lam, hello Sawai, uh, asks, are the bows also better with age?
Ooh. I'm not sure it makes as much difference with the bows, except that, for both the instruments and the bows, I mean, the real magic comes from the person who made them, who brought a particular genius in understanding how to choose the material and how to carve the material and how to shape the material to get exactly the result that they wanted. This, for me, is true artistry. And that's true with the bow makers as well. Choosing the right woods. The older bow makers had an advantage again because right now the wood is almost exclusively woods that comes from Brazil, which is being very rapidly deforested. And so we run the risk that there'll be a time when there is not enough wood for people to make bows anymore. But the great bow makers understand the wood and how to work the wood, how to shape it, how to curve it, and they have their own personal style of craftsmanship. And just as with the violin makers, there's a phenomenal number of outstanding modern bow makers who will, in 100 years from now, this might be viewed as the golden age of bow making.
Dr. Millar asks another question. What happens if you have one of the best violins, but not so with a great bow? Are there bow auctions or are they sold separately? I understand that there are some bows priced as high as $70,000.
There's some priced even higher than that these days. All the auctions have instruments and bows, and all the dealers will have both violin instruments and bows for sale. And there's nothing saying that one bow necessarily has to suit a certain instrument. The instrument, the bow, the player, and their personal style and training will all go into the result. And in fact, if you have 4 different bows and 1 violin, for all intents and purposes, you have 4 violins because each bow will get a different sound out of that violin.
We have time for one more question. Anyone have my back pocket question was, tell us about bows. No, quite okay. I'm going to go ahead and ask for violins. Cremona is sort of the center of the universe. Is France the center of the universe for bows?
Paris was, and Paris has been a dominant center of violin playing. In fact, of music in general since the days of Louis XIII. It was a very important center for instrument making and instrument commerce. It's because it was the center of music performance in France. If you were a great bow maker, you could make a living in Paris much better than you could if you stayed in Mirecourt. So Paris just automatically became the center with all the great bow makers. And I think it still is that way to a degree today, although many of those Parisian bow makers spend an awful lot of their time in places like Brittany and the south of France and other exotic places.
Thank you. Joel Rosenberg asks whether there are any violas in any of these collections that we've been talking about.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah, actually, my father had an Amati viola that's been on exhibit at both Cremona and the Met. Very special because there's so few.
Which Amati?
Which Amati? Andre.
Andrea, the grandfather.
The grandfather, right? The
Right.
first, right. That was there's an actually very interesting story, but we unfortunately won't have time. Gabriel Schaff asks, how would a new collector begin building a collection today with the financial equations being different? What should be collected?
Ooh, gosh, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I have a fairly long list of schools that I think have been overlooked and schools which I think will be appreciated more over time, both for violins and bows. and I would look at the quality instruments and bows from those places. Paris, Vienna, London. I'm very fond of the Dutch and the Flemish makers working in Brussels. You can still get 18th and 17th century instruments from those schools for much less than you'd pay for an Italian. I have a good friend who started collecting American violins. Before he knew it, he ended up with this enormous collection of American violins before anybody appreciated them.
I have one question from Jim Exum, and I would like to endorse it, but not for today. He's asking, will Peter and Philip please play a duet? We unfortunately don't have time, and that wasn't the way we had set up for today. Today was just going to be a conversation about the friendships and the things that bind the souls to the instruments and to the chamber music. But I hope soon the coronavirus will be behind us, and maybe we can even gather in this living room and hear a duet by the two of you.
I am very much looking forward to playing with Peter on Wednesday. I cannot tell you how much music has made things bearable during this past year. All this time when I would have loved to have been traveling, and I couldn't do it. And I was basically stuck within the numerous sets of four walls in my house. But to be able to sit down with a friend and play music and experience the way the voices interact and the emotional conclusions that the music reaches, and to share that with another person. This is precious. This is really what life is all about. So I'm really looking forward to this.
I couldn't agree more with Philip. I'm looking forward to playing with him again, but there's just nothing like making music with other people.
Yes.
And when you can perform great music, even if you don't perform it greatly yourself, but just to have the opportunity to play it with someone else is a gift beyond any value I could put on it. It's the greatest gift of my life.
That is certainly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that the quartet form for me is the ideal one too. Besides the fact that there is such phenomenally great music that's composed for string quartets, it's a group that is small enough that there's a personal connection to it, but large enough that you can see how everything meshes. You don't get lost in the texture like in an orchestra. You're not sort of out alone on front of things the way a soloist is, but you're with three other people, and you know that what you do is going to make a difference to the ultimate results. And that is just priceless.
The emotional conclusion. I love that phrase you just shared. Philip and Peter, thank you so much for sharing this afternoon with us. We are indebted to you for your friendship, for your willingness to share all of your observations and thoughts and your love for chamber music and each other. Thank you so much. I think we have some instructions in our chat box for all of the participants to be able to subscribe to us, because this is our inaugural event. We will have many, many more. We'll have conversations, and we will also have live performances that we will live stream. We are establishing something we're calling the Fine Instruments Cultural and Education Center, which is essentially sort of this living room in a more organized way. So if you would like to participate in our future activities, no membership fees, there'll be no tickets charged. Just come as the guests to my parents' living room came. Just come as you are. Be very open. We will trust you as long as you trust us. And let's curate and be good caretakers of the music and the instruments and each other. Thank you all very, very much. Please check your chat box, and I think there's some links where we will hopefully be able to post this recorded session onto our YouTube channel after Peter and Philip have had a chance to make sure that everything they said is okay with them. They have editorial control over what we will post. Thank you all very much. Bye bye now.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. Wonderful pleasure. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.